Welcome back, friends. We are on our last story for the week, story number 5, called The Division of the United States. Our words for this story is the word Confederacy. Confederacy is a government formed by the United States in the South after they withdrew from the United States. The Confederacy was prepared to fight to keep the Southern's way of life alive. Our next word is elected. Elected means chosen by a vote to do something or to be in a certain position. Gene was elected by his fellow students to be the new class president. Heritage. Something that is inherited or passed down, traditions or ways of doing things that haven't changed over time. It's called a heritage. Abby's grandmother encouraged her to be proud of her Native American heritage. Our next word, succeeded, means to withdraw membership from an established group. People have succeeded from groups throughout history, usually to form a new group. And our last word is union. The northern states did not secede from the United States. Were called a union. So the northern states did not leave the United States group is what we call the union. The union was prepared to fight to keep the states together and to abolish slavery. In an earlier speech, President Lincoln stated, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." What do you think is meant by that? What do you think is meant by a country torn apart would have a hard time trying to prove they could stand on their own? Today, you're going to listen to find out whether your predictions are true or correct about what is going to happen to the country because of the people's different views on slavery. Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election in 1860 to become the 16th president of the United States. Unfortunately, the elections only proved how divided the country really was. Lincoln believed that slavery should not be expanded to the new states being formed in the West. Many people in the North agreed with this idea and voted for Lincoln. In the South, many people disliked Lincoln, and in fact, people could not even vote for Lincoln in 9 states in the South because his name was not on their list of candidates. Despite not being on the ballot in 9 states, and without the support of a single Southern state, on November 8, 1860, Lincoln was elected or chosen president because there were more people living in the North who voted for him. Many of the Southern states strongly believed that the North and President Lincoln wanted to take away their right to set their own laws and wanted to abolish slavery. The conflict was worsened. A couple of months after Lincoln was elected president, something unbelievable happened. Something Lincoln and many others had feared and hoped would never happen. Several Southern states succeeded or declared they were no longer part of the United States. South Carolina was the first state to succeed. The states of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed. All 7 supported slavery, and all believed that the United States government under Lincoln would force them into doing things they did not want to do, such as abolish slavery. These Southern states intensely believed that they should be in charge of themselves, so they broke away and declared that they were forming their own country. They called their new country the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. So you can see those states here in the gray. Those are what we call the Confederate States. Those are the people that wanted to keep slavery alive and wanted to basically leave the U.S. and not be a part of there. Okay? The Confederacy elected its own president, a man named Jefferson Davis. And in this picture, you can see how divided the country was. In the blue, we have the Union States, which again were the states that agreed with not having slavery. And they consider themselves, United States, what it should be. Then we have the territories that didn't decide to have or to not keep slavery. But Lincoln was not going to allow the United States of America to be broken up into two separate countries. Lincoln said that it was against national law for a state to secede. Therefore, he said that he would do everything in his power to unify the country. He hoped that he would be able to do this peacefully without a war. Nobody wanted a war, including Jefferson Davis. But as the months passed, it became clear that it would be impossible to avoid it. Why do you think people thought it would be impossible to avoid a war between the North and the South? To learn what happened next, it is important to know about an event that took place in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, in April of 1861, just after Lincoln became president. Charleston was a beautiful, charming, and wealthy city in the South. Its residents were proud of their beautiful city and proud of their Southern heritage. Charleston was an important port city. From its harbor, valuable goods such as cotton, sugar, and tobacco, which had been grown and harvested by enslaved Africans on plantations, were carried by ships across the sea to countries in Europe. So again, when the people in Europe bought the goods from these southern communities, it helps the economy in the South. Important ports like Charleston needed protection, so they built forts along the shore. The largest and most important of these was called Fort Sumter. Forts like these, with their large cannons and soldiers, were built to protect the harbor from invasion by pirates and enemy ships in times of war. Although Fort Sumter was in South Carolina, a Confederate state, the fort still belonged to the United States. The Confederates wanted Sumter for themselves. They knew that they could not have a real country of their own as long as the United States soldiers were guarding the fort and controlling its guns. Fort Sumter was also created a problem for President Lincoln. It was a fort located in an area now claimed by the Confederacy. President Lincoln now had three options. 1, tell the U.S. soldiers to leave the fort. 2, send more U.S. soldiers to defend the fort against the Confederate soldiers. Or 3, send supplies, such as food, to the fort to see if the Confederate soldiers would try to stop them. This was a difficult decision. If President Lincoln chose the first option, having the U.S. soldiers leave the fort, he would be saying that he agreed with the South Carolina's decision to secede. If he chose the second option, sending more troops to defend the fort, the Confederacy might accuse him of starting a war. President Lincoln chose the third option, sending new supplies to see if the Confederacy would let the ships through. At the same time, the Confederates raised an army of their own. They surrounded Fort Sumter and tried to convince the soldiers inside to surrender. But the soldiers said they had orders from President Lincoln to stay put, and that is exactly what those soldiers did. When the Confederacy heard President Lincoln was planning to send more supplies to the fort, the Confederacy opened fire. Early on the morning of April 12, 1861, before the sun had even risen, a woman named Mary Boykin Chestnut sat upright in her bed, and though she'd awakened from a bad dream, as though she had awakened from a bad dream. Then she heard a sound, the same type of sound that had shaken her from her sleep, a distant loud boom as described in her diary. Thinking it must be thunder, she put her head back down on the pillow. The room was pitch black, but through the windows, she could see that the sun was just barely beginning to rise, casting a light blue, slightly yellow light in the eastern sky. Suddenly, there was a series of very loud explosions. Boom, boom, boom. These sounds were so much closer. Mary Chestnut knew then that the sounds were from cannons, not thunders. The cannons in the small fort nearest the town were opening fire, and Miss Chestnut knew that these were Confederate cannons. Mary walked out onto the upstairs porch in time to see the light from the nearby cannons as they fired another volley into the early morning air. Mary was witnessing the bombardment of Fort Sumter. All morning, all afternoon, and all through the night, for 34 straight hours, the Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter. The U.S. soldiers in the fort had cannons of their own, and they fired back. The air around Charleston filled with smoke from the explosions of the massive guns. As the house rattled from the boom of the guns, Mary Chestnut sat and wrote down in her journal, "Fort Sumter has been on fire." Then, in the early evening of April 13, all the guns fell silent, and the U.S. soldiers in Fort Sumter finally surrendered. Amazingly, nobody on either side had been killed or seriously injured by enemy fire. Damaged Fort Sumter now belonged to the Confederacy. More important, it became clear that war could not be avoided. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, more southern states joined the Confederacy: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, as well as portions of Kentucky and Missouri. In all, there were 13 Confederate states, all from the South. It is important to remember that the states of Kentucky and Missouri did not actually secede from the United States, even though some people from those states decided to fight for the Confederacy. The remaining states, those that had not succeeded, were in the North, and they became known as the Union. So as you can see from this map, the map is changing. We have more people joining the Confederate states, some of the territory states in yellow, like Oregon, which couldn't decide, are now part of the Union, which were against slavery. So is Kansas. The map is just expanding, and people are moving from different sides all the time. The Confederacy made a flag to symbolize its new country. The Confederacy flag, pictured at the bottom left, has 7 stars to symbolize the first set of states that seceded from the Union. The flag pictured on the bottom right, with 13 stars, symbolizes the Confederacy after the Battle of Fort Sumter, when more states joined. States in the Union continued to fly the traditional flag of the United States, pictured at the top, which at the time of the Civil War had 34 stars, 1 for each state, including the Confederate States. With the Battle of Fort Sumter, a new and painful chapter of American history began. Mary Chestnut, for her part, continued to in her journal, keeping a record of the Civil War through the eyes of a Southerner. By the end of the war, Charleston, where it all began, was very fortunate that it had not burned to the ground like many other cities in the South. It is now time for our questions. Question 1. Were your predictions about whether the country was being torn apart because of its different views on slavery correct? Why or why not? Number 2. To what important job was Lincoln elected a couple years after losing the Senate race to Douglas? Question 3. What was the word union a name for? Which flags are actually being shown here? And what do the stars represent? Question 4. Why did South Carolina and then additional Southern states decide to secede from the United States once Lincoln was elected? Number 5. What name did these states give their new country? How do you know? Question 6. How did Lincoln feel about the Southern states? And number 7. Why did the Confederates fire cannons on Fort Sumter? Were they able to take over the fort? Why or why not?